Tucker will talk, and you may be surprised to learn that this will be his last Sunday as a regular speaker. Bob related to me that when he was a full-time minister, in the routine of his week, he would allocate time for a sermon, and it would be done. But now that he's retired and his structure is less organized, sometimes a sermon can take up the entire month. So it's time for him to pursue after other pursuits. And I hope that, of course, we'll see him from time to time, but all the same, today is the last official Sunday. And I just want to remind you that he was the minister at the First Congregational Church in Houston for nearly 30 years. He was also an interim minister at Houston's First Unitarian Universalist Church. He and Maggie visited us monthly for, I think it's over 5 years now. He inspired us with his wisdom and his experiences. In Houston, his volunteer activities, he's been a child advocate. He's helped found and continue the Board of Justice for Children, and was on the board of the Houston Area Women's Center, a rape crisis and counseling shelter and women's shelter. All right, so I hope we see him again another time. But please, let's have Bob, and his sermon today is entitled Surprised by Joy.
Well, thank you very much, Mary. Actually, it was 7 years that, as I went back into the records and looked at 7 years that I've been talking at the Unitarian Fellowship. I begin today with a story from Garrison Keillor, blog of Minnesota Life, and it appeared this week. Ola lay on his deathbed. He was dying and he knew it. And then he got a little whiff of Lena's rhubarb pie. He gingerly rolled out of his bed and crept down to the kitchen, and there it was on the kitchen table. He let out a moan of desire and pleasure. And then Lena whacked him on the side of the head and said, "That's for the funeral. Now leave it alone." The theme of this month, as Mary mentioned, is quite appropriately joy. Joy to the world will resound on TV. In churches, one of the Advent candles being lit is a candle of joy. And Christmas cards arrive oft proclaiming joy. Knowing that joy was this month's topic, the first thing that popped into my head was a song I learned while working at a YMCA camp titled Joy. And showing some compassion for your ears, I will speak the words instead of singing them, even though I still remember the melody. Jesus and others in you, what a wonderful way to spell joy. Jesus and others in you, in the heart of each girl and boy. J is for Jesus, who shows you the way. O is for others you help every day. Y is for you, put yourself last and spell joy. Now, if desired, you can substitute for Jesus something that pulls you into each day, something gets your mind and muscles and purpose moving. But the joy pattern is not a bad, simple formula for daily encouragement. I did not pursue that song for this talk, since once I said what I have said, there was not much left to say other than expanding on the obvious. But it was another statement that tantalizingly stuck in my mind and which I could not dislodge. The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. That juxtaposition of joy and sorrow is something a poet created. It is not something that naturally comes to mind. Generally, I think we just see joy and sorrow as two separate items, not together. In general, that's true, except that we do put the two together in the lighting of the candles of joys and concerns. In tracing, pardon me, in tracing this phrase, I discovered that this provocative passage came from the writer Khalil Gibran in the book, The Prophet, and it has stuck with me through the years. The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. Unable to shake myself loose from that passage, I decided to follow up on it for today's talk. Joy embedded in sorrow, and sorrow embedded in joy. Well, we do find sorrow embedded in joy, do we not? People that we treasure, parents and siblings, spouse and children, friends and neighbors, when gone, leave us with a great sorrow. The loss of a special heirloom, moving from a place we have lived, losing an ideal that has guided us, can be incredibly sad. And we've all experienced items like that. Anne Lamott, a California writer, wrote, "You will lose someone you can't live without, and your heart will be badly broken. And the bad news is that you never completely get over the loss of your beloved. But this is also the good news. They live forever in your broken heart that cannot seal back up. And you came through. It's like having a broken leg that never heals perfectly, that still hurts when the weather gets cold, but you learn to dance with the limp." So yes, the poet and the author are right. We do find sorrow embedded in our joys. But it is the reverse of which Gibran writes that's also true. Do we find joy in loss? Well, I thought about it, and I decided that if true, it certainly is far less evident. And in exploring that idea, I found I could not honestly do so except by reflecting on my own experiences. So the rest of this talk, I'm going to be autobiographical about two tumultuous periods in my life that, upon examination, I found give substance to Gibran's words. The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. Even though autobiographical, I hope that what I say will trigger in you a desire to talk with your own life experiences. Well, the first incident that I looked at took place during my last year of high school and the 2 years following graduation. I had not thought of that period for decades, and this talk brought it all back. In 3 years, I went through 5 career choices. 5. Imagine the inner turmoil of that process. Now I can calmly think and speak of that time. But what I cannot convey is the inner turmoil that surrounded those 3 years. To describe it, I could use the word obsession with a capital O. I've never been able to understand the source of that kind of passionate pursuit to know what I was going to do for the rest of my life. But 3 years is a long time of turmoil, especially in those adolescent years. My first career choice of the 5 was chosen in my last year of high school when I joined the Navy Reserve at 17, intending the Navy to be my career. I went through Great Lakes Naval Training Center, worked toward becoming an electronic technician on a submarine. That was my goal. But for some reason, and I know not why now, after high school graduation, I pushed that aside and began a study of chemistry at the University of Minnesota, intending to teach in high school. Career choice number 2. The sudden decision to go to the university was a strange one. Strange because college was not something ever mentioned in our home. Neither of my parents had a high school diploma, and getting through high school was accomplishment enough. After 1 quarter at the university, I quit and began working at Central Research Division of Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company, 3M, which led to seeing myself as a chemical researcher, a career choice, number 3. And with that, I knew I was certainly on my way. However, alongside all that, I worked for 2 summers at a YMCA camp, 1 summer as a cabin counselor, and 1 summer as waterfront director. The outdoor life, working with youth, were a compelling draw, and that led me to examine being a professional in the YMCA. Career choice number 4. And then during all of this time, woven into all of this, I was also being encouraged by a minister to pursue ministry as an occupation. And that is what I finally decided to do. Career choice number 5. In retrospect of the 5, choosing a career as a minister was the most unusual, even perhaps the most absurd. After all, I had been in the church only 2 years, not attending in my childhood years, and thus my knowledge and experience of the church was pretty skimpy. Compounding that was that the church of which I was a part for those 2 years was a liberal congregational church where beliefs were not emphasized, a creed never used, and sermons were non-literal. I did not even know religious language. I remember being with a group of college theological students, and they were talking about being called. Called, I thought, what's that? Ministry, like any profession, was something one chose to do. Such God talk left me mystified. Still, I claimed the profession of being ordained minister, and I stuck with that. That was the turmoil. Now for part of the joy. Of course, in any job or occupation, there are ups and downs, times of wondering what I'm doing here. But for me, the ministry was an enriching and enlivening choice. I could sit down with a person over lunch and say, tell me about yourself. And being a minister and a good listener, a person would share her or his life story. Rarely did conversations note the weather. As such, I learned of the struggles of people to make do of their lives. What I began to call the awesome tenacity of the human spirit to be and to do. Reading was part of the job, and each week I got to give shape to an idea in a sermon, pushing and refining my thinking. Each week I designed worship. Instead of just taking last week's bulletin, crossing out hymn numbers and a sermon title and replacing them, I could take the theme of a service and design the order of worship to fit the theme. I had workshops and seminars open to me across the country that continually pushed my understanding. And then there's the freedom of the days. No one was keeping track of my daily life. Other professionals, doctors, lawyers, and others were tied to a calendar of appointments. Now, I have known ministers for whom such freedom led to laziness, but laziness was never my problem. Usually, for example, I worked through Wednesday night, went home for breakfast with the kids, showered, and left for another day of work. And strangely, although it sounds sort of crazy, instead of energy being depleted, I found my job providing me with more energy. Well, I hope you pick up a sense of delight. All of that came long after the turmoil of crunching anxiety by one mixed up kid. So in this sense, I found Gibran to be right. The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. But there was another joyful aspect in my ministry that came out in the five-year turmoil. That early search made me sensitive to the youth around who were also searching for their own way in life. Many were as vocationally uncertain, as conflicted as I was in my youth. I got to know youth in a ninth grade confirmation program based on 6 overnights from after school on Friday until Saturday afternoon, and where I was sleeping in a bedroll on the floor of a church with the youth, doing that even at the age of 65. In those intimate sessions, I got to know the youth and they got to know me. And when I saw a person who had the gifts and graces, that's a wonderful term I picked up from the Methodist, when a person had the gifts and graces and did not have a firm vocational plan, I would mention ministry. And several youth did become ministers. There was also another group of people who were needing direction, already ordained ministers. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was a tumultuous time in churches and in ministries, and many ministers gave up on their church and their profession. Since First Congregational was a non-dogmatic and had a rich life, quite a number of folk already ordained in a variety of denominations became members. In talking to them, they found that they could reaffirm their ordination vows, and they re-entered professional church life. And so the two groups, high school members and the already ordained, together totaled 24 who became UCC ministers in the 28 years that I was at the church. That was quite incredible. In retrospect, I am convinced that it was my own early vocational anguish that made me sensitive to the state of others. So perhaps Gibran is right. The deeper that sorrow cuts into our being, the more joy we can contain. So this is the second joy that came from my tumultuous years. The deeper the sorrow cuts, the more joy that one can contain. I want now to suffer to a second period of anguish that I explored in checking out Gibran. And by the way, both the former turmoil that I mentioned and the current are things that I had not thought about for decades, but I came up as I was trying to work through Gibran's passage for this talk. My graduate theological education took place at the University of Chicago. The university was and is an intense academic institution. Students design T-shirts and sweatshirts to indicate this. One sweatshirt said, "The level of hell Dante forgot," University of Chicago. Another, "When you sleep, we study, University of Chicago. And the one that I always liked the most was the most expressive, Where Fun Comes to Die, University of Chicago. Well, you can pick up both the serious thinking and the sarcastic, self-deprecating sense of humor found in some of the churches. In fact, I've used to visualize a prospective student coming on campus with parents in tow and seeing a student wearing a sweatshirt with these words, Where Fun Comes to Die, University of Chicago. I can see some eyebrows raised and saying, let's get out of here. Whereas other perspectives would look with a smile on their face saying, where do I sign up? Well, graduating after 3 years of study, I left school with the feeling that I was less than a complete human being without a PhD. Academics was that strong. No one ever said that, and I certainly, and if I had shared that with professors and fellow students, they would think that overzealous studying had addled my brain. But nevertheless, the feeling of incompleteness without a doctorate was there, and it stayed there. And so for the next 11 years of my life, 6 in serving a church in South Dakota and 5 teaching in Turkey, I had this overlay of thinking that I had to get back to school for that doctorate. That thought didn't interfere with my life work, but it just hung there in my mind. Having sold out to go to Turkey and having sold out to leave Turkey, it was time on returning to the States to act on the return to school, which I did. Pardon me, that I'm on the computer and it's bouncing around a little. And so what I did on coming back, I went to the University of Minnesota and got into a doctoral program. However, being that close to academia, I slowly discarded the idea of spending another 3 years of my life to obtain a degree and then spending my years doing work that had less and less appeal. And just as this divorce was happening between the ideal that I had lived with for so many years and the reality of what I was finding in academia, I got a phone call late Sunday night at the end of December in 1970, asking if I would be interested in looking at a church in Houston. I had no idea or desire to go to Texas or to Houston, but I did, and it was a very productive 3 decades of my life. Out of that loss of a long-held dream, I found joy by leaving it and coming to Texas. Well, let me recap where we've been today. The theme of the month of December is joy. And I mentioned an old camp ditty that stuck to my mind, how to spell joy. And I found something else that tantalized me, the words of the poet Khalil Gibran, that spoke of a reciprocity of joy and sorrow, that sorrow embedded in joy and joy embedded in sorrow. I thought the former we would all readily assent to because we have all felt the sorrow at the loss of things that we have loved. But the poet also wrote, the deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. Was it really true that the things that we find of joy come out of sorrows? that was a bit more problematic. It seemed to me that the only real way to get at this was to put my own experience under a microscope. And that I did. For the first time, I found the poet right. Major joys in my life were rooted in some mighty painful times. I wonder if that's true of you as well. And I would suggest that you spend some time looking at your life and looking over some of the painful times and what the repercussions of those times have been later in your life. Well, I want to add a postscript to this talk. The end of November 2014 was the first time I spoke to the fellowship, 7 years and 1 week ago. And so I'm going to add being with this fellowship to the joys that came forth from my departure from this doctoral fixation. It paved the way to come to Houston, and it made possible the very happy association I've had with you all, or you all, to what I've learned to say here. And one more postscript. I left Ole and Lena dangling at the beginning of this talk. Actually, I had a use for them, but that link disappeared as I developed the talk. Still, I like the story so much that I thought I would use it anyway. Even in the misery of his deathbed, Ole found some joy in remembrance of the smell of some freshly baked rhubarb pie before the hard knock of reality set in. I thank you for your attention today.